Um, the strategy remains to try to get Sunni tribesmen to come over and fight. Many of them are still reluctant. Many of them are terrified because, in fact, ISIS has made a point of going into some villages and massacring tribesmen who they think are not going to, roll over and obey ISIS. And they're also still not trusting the Shia-led government. And the strategy in Syria is being done without any really reliable partners at all, because there is no real moderate Syrian rebel army to speak of. We're busy training up what they hope will be the first group of them of about 2,000 or 3,000 max by this May. ISIS, we don't know how many troops there are in ISIS, but we know they continue to pull in recruits from all over the Muslim world, all over Europe and America. And the estimates are there's 20,000, 30,000 of them. So it's going to be a long time before there's a force that can go into Syria. And bombs can't do the job. Anyway, I could go on, and I should open this up to questions. If any of you have any. Yeah, Robert.
Martin, in light of that, how did you react to the President's glancing reference to the status of the situation?
I did. This is in the State of the Union, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I was at a function, so I didn't get to hear it, but I did ask. I asked Linda, the co-producer, who happens to be here and should receive some credit, a lot of credit for this film. What he had said, and it was very little apparently. It was, as you mentioned, a glancing reference. I mean, they're stymied as to what to do. I'm now, Linda and I are engaged in putting together a sequel to this that will focus more on the conditions inside Syria that allowed them to incubate as they did. This focused more on the Iraqi side of the border. But what happened there was that the President and his men, for good reason, were really reluctant, reticent to get involved. And in spite of warnings that by not getting involved, ISIS would rise up out of this mess, they didn't act. And now there's a real question whether or not that was the right decision. I think, I don't think he wants to draw a lot of attention to this. And I think that the campaign is going to take this up. And Hillary has sided with those who believe that we made a huge mistake in not aiding the moderate rebels, and that will be a campaign plank for her. But I didn't see the actual reference. Right here?
Where do they get their money?
It's a great question. Initially, as we reported, when you have Bashar al-Assad cracking down and on what were initially peaceful protests, and those videos going out in real time like never before, and people seeing atrocities all across the Sunni world, they say, my people are being slaughtered, much like the Spanish Civil War. They rally to the cause, and deep-pocketed sheikhs who don't particularly want to go pick up a gun start putting up money. It's not so much governments. It's been alleged the governments of Qatar and Saudi Arabia were supporting ISIS-like extremist groups. I don't think that was the case, but there's certainly sheikhs around the region that were and continue. But eventually they became, as we reported, self-sustaining in that they were able to take over oil fields and whatnot. Now they've lost some of that to the bombing. But there's still a network of people who feel this is a righteous cause. We don't spend time looking at the atrocities that they're enduring. And there's tremendous power in that. So there is a calling throughout the Sunni world that says this is a just cause and we must support it. Some money comes from that. Right here, so.
Martin, if you were to be an advisor to DC, what would be your policy recommendations?
Next question. Gosh. You know, I think we have to do something to prevent children from freezing to death in Jordan refugee camps. I think we can do a better job there. I think I would not favor getting deeply involved in the Syrian conflict. I don't see this as any kind of existential threat to the United States. There are things that we can do. We could take out some of his, in Syria, we could, but we don't have many tools in Syria to go after ISIS. The question is, should we be going after Bashar al-Assad and somehow getting a resolution? It gets very complex. What you're seeing here is a war between Sunnis and Shia that is where you have proxy armies fighting on behalf of either Iran or Saudi Arabia. You got to knock some heads together and get people to talk, and that's what's happening right now in Moscow as the Russians are getting upset about this. And I think you pursue those kind of diplomatic initiatives, but I really don't think we have a lot of good options, and I think the president doesn't mention this in the State of the Union address because he realizes that they're really scratching their heads. They don't know what to do. In the back?
Yeah, thanks very much. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Kurdistan, what its level of autonomy and security.
Well, I think the Peshmerga have rallied. I mean, they were off guard in the beginning, and ISIS had all these very good American-made built weapons. And in fact, I was hearing that they had a very good day-to-day pushing back ISIS in one battle yesterday. I'm not sure what you're getting at. I mean, I think that what's come out of this is that the Kurds have taken more control, more autonomy out of this situation. Immediately after the fall of Mosul, they moved in to protect Kirkuk, which was really not in their territory, although it's predominantly, I mean, it's on their border. And they have secured their own state, essentially.
Right, because there was a lot of talk, especially last year, that there was going to be a split.
Yeah, and I think that it's hard for the Sunnis. I'm going down to Washington tomorrow to meet with 10 sheikhs from Anbar province who are touring the State Department and the White House and the Pentagon, trying to figure out what America can do for them. They're looking at the Kurdish situation and saying, hey, the Kurds have got all this, why should we settle for anything less? We want more, they want more autonomy. So the Kurds, I think, are in a pretty good situation. I mean, if you can call any of this a good situation. Sir?
Two-part question. Has the ability to raise money been impacted for ISIS by the 60% drop in the price of oil? And my second question is, if anything happens to Bashar al-Assad, what happens from there?
Well, that's what the administration fears. The second part of your question being about what happens if Bashar al-Assad falls. And they don't want to get too involved in toppling him until they have some assurance that there's something to come after him. And right now, it would be ISIS or Nusra, the other extremist group, the official Al-Qaeda affiliate. So that's a nightmare scenario. As to the funding and the price of oil, that has a big effect in that the two patrons, Russia and Iran, are losing money now on you know, they're not as able to come to Bashar's aid as they were, and so that's a problem for him.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your excellent film with us.
Thank you.
When I watch documentaries like this, I'm as much interested in the people who do give you interviews, Dempsey, Panetta and so on, as the people who don't. And I'm wondering who are the interviews that you would have liked to have in this? They didn't make it. I'm thinking you must have asked Maliki, and I don't know what he's doing today. Maybe you could share that. And obviously, if you're making a documentary about Islamic State, you want to in some way get Islamic State in there. Of course, you don't want to compromise your own security, a la Jim Foley, but given that you're making a movie about, a film about Syria now, how are you treading this line in terms of gaining access, presenting their side? I'm thinking Skype interviews or academics or their supporters in the West. Some way of presenting the Islamic side, Islamic State face of this in your next film.
It's a good idea. I mean, you can get Skype interviews, although I haven't seen them with leadership. I've seen them with fighters. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I had phone numbers of people in Mosul who were under ISIS control, and I had somebody offer me an interview with Baghdadi. I don't know how serious it was. He claimed to have been in prison with him in Buka when Baghdadi was an American prisoner. And I sort of joked, I said, well, here's my Skype address. The only news organization, well, there's 2 news organizations that have actually gotten inside. Vice got inside under certain agreements and conditions that we don't really fully know what they agreed to. And there's a German reporter, a 74-year-old guy who got in. But, you know, neither of them talked to leadership per se. As far as the first part of your question about talking to people, Maliki, we tried very hard to get to Maliki. I've interviewed Maliki in the past.
What's he doing nowadays?
He's trying to revive his career. I mean, he is a vice president. There are several vice presidents, but he has political power. He has a following. And, you know, if you read the Arabic or Iraqi press carefully, he comes up once in a while. It doesn't show up in our papers, but he is trying to maneuver, and he makes it hard for a body. Anybody like that in the government is not going to make the Sunni tribesmen willing to come to, you know, join the fight. So there were a lot of people I would have liked to have gotten, and I'll say that the White House was reticent to give us anybody until they gave us the Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, who came forward, I think it was 2 weeks before we aired or so.
And he's not very good either, is he?
Well, you know, he's good in that he's there. He's in the inner circle. He's in those meetings. He's formulating policy. But he has a kind of bumbling, I mean, I would have suggested to them that they could have done better. And I thought we should have had other voices from the White House. We made that pitch. Linda certainly made that pitch in a number of occasions, I know, and we couldn't get anywhere. We were lucky to get him.
Yeah, I had a question about, you'd mentioned the Ba'athist support and how important that was, and I know there's been a lot of talk of Itzhak al-Dori, who used to be, you know, sort of top of the deck of cards, who's apparently somewhere in this process. Do you think, I should say, how strong is this Ba'athist influence, and do you think that if they were bought off in some way, that ISIS, at least within Iraq, could quickly fall?
I don't know that you can separate the Ba'athists from the hardcore jihadi ISIS, because they spent time in prison together, they found common cause. The Ba'athists find the religious sort of wrapping a very useful tool. They can get suicide bombers coming in from North Africa to run these attacks, and gives them a military advantage that they wouldn't have. I think it's very hard. If you could, the question of buying them off. It's been rumored that al-Duri, who you mentioned, who was number 2 to Saddam Hussein, who's up in Mosul, was going to come over and fight against ISIS, and that hasn't materialized. The CIA doesn't really know, I don't think, just how many, because we've done many sort of different analyses with different experts on how many Ba'athists are there, and it ranges from 70% to 30%, you know, of the leadership, and we don't quite know. But I don't see any sign that they're about to jump out. Right here.
Yes, I'm going back a little bit. The documentary was wonderful as he explains how Al-Qaeda morphed into ISIS. But now that doesn't seem to be the case. Al-Qaeda seems to be operating separately from ISIS. So, could you explain how that happened? They walked into ISIS, now they're separate again.
Do you have an hour? It's a bit complicated. I'll try to make it simple. There is a time in 2011, in the summer of 2011, that Baghdadi decides to send this guy named Jolani over to form a franchise operation. Remember, this time Baghdadi is Al-Qaeda. It's actually called the Islamic State of Iraq, but they're the old Al-Qaeda in Iraq group. Jolani goes over there and he forms Nusra. I kept it out of the film just so that our heads didn't spin too much. Eventually, when you get to early last year, there's a split, and Nusra goes its own way, and ISIS separates from them. But they're basically, they fight sometimes together, sometimes separately. Nusra has the blessing of the Al-Qaeda Central in Pakistan under Zawahiri, but that's basically, it's like the kind of splits I remember among radicals in college, between different groups. I think it could switch at any time. They could come together and fight together. I don't think it goes too deep.
Martin,
Alan.
great job as always.
Thank you.
How big of an intelligence failure, if there was one, do you think this all is? Because many of the people you interviewed had the sense of like, hey, the way I was reading this stuff, this is inevitable.
I think the intelligence failure, I've thought a lot about this. We talked a lot about it. I don't think it was so much that we didn't know that ISIS wasn't a gathering storm to be reckoned with. But what I think we didn't understand very well was how rotten the Iraqi army was, and that the fall of Fallujah and then Mosul and then a host of other towns up and down the Tigris was a big surprise. We didn't have military advisors. This goes back to the decision that was made to pull out, and we couldn't get an agreement with the Iraqi government, the Iraqi parliament, to leave some people there. So we didn't have advisors on the ground who could have told us that in the barracks where there were supposed to be 1,000 fighters, there were only 200. And the numbers were like that. They were stark. In Mosul, there really wasn't much of an army to put up a fight, and that was the intelligence failure. The apparent intelligence failure based on what Panetta is saying, I think Obama basically saw this, and Panetta, if he were here, he would agree with this. Obama simply said, this is not a threat to the United States, and there's lots of places in the world. I mean, he famously made a comment about, there's people in the Congo that are suffering, and we don't go there. So why should we go? We just can't go everywhere. We don't have those kind of resources, and frankly, he knows that he was elected by people who said, enough. We don't want to do any of this stuff anymore. So I don't think it was just an intelligence failure. He was finally forced to act. Yeah.
One thing that I found intriguing was the ISIS talk about the caliphate and no state borders, and a lot of the borders were arbitrary or artificial. Do you think there might, since Syria and Iraq are pretty much failed states now and the region is in turmoil, might there be a whole shifting of borders and maybe some kind of migration where, couldn't be Shia versus Sunni in so many separate states?
Well, that's a good question for me to direct to the Sunni leaders. I'm meeting with the governor of Anbar province tomorrow and a host of Sunni sheikhs. I think that the consensus in Washington is somehow Iraq can be put back together and the border can be reestablished, but that Syria, for a long time now, will be a failed state with ISIS they control half of the territory. It's not half of the population, but it's half of the territory. And that's not about to go away. There's a good argument to be made that they can't, even in Iraq, push ISIS back across the border. So you're left with a sort of a Sunnistan there. It depends, how much is Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, how much are they going to invest to make sure that happens? The problem with the three-state solution that's been talked about for Iraq is that the Kurds in the north have oil and the Shia in the south have oil, but the Sunnis in the middle maybe have some gas, but they don't have any oil. They don't have much in terms of resource. They'd be a stepchild of the Saudis that would have to sponsor them. But I'm sorry, I can't give you a definitive answer. I really don't know. I don't know that anybody knows. Marcel?
Watching this a second time, I was sort of curious. The film shows the Sunni tribes and the people embracing ISIS, but they get so extreme. At what point will the Sunni contingent of the Middle East say, this is too much, I'm not gonna, you know.
Right. Good question. I mean, the governments have said that. I mean, ISIS has done a wonderful job of unifying a lot of governments against them. But you have to remember that the atrocities committed by Bashar and by Maliki's government are either ongoing or are fresh in their memories. And, this is 87 executions in Saudi Arabia last year. Many of them are beheadings. We don't know exactly how many. I mean, so it looks extraordinarily vicious to us, but perhaps not so to some of the desert tribes. But there has been a sort of revulsion about the violence, and there has been a coming together, but still no sort of firm commitment from either the Sunni tribes, and some have sided against ISIS, some not. It's still all in play.
And Baghdad is safe in Erbil?
I think Baghdad was never as threatened. I was in Baghdad when they were threatening it, and I was in Erbil at the moment that the bombings started, and I was in a refugee camp out near Mosul, and 2 days after I left there, that whole camp of 6,000 people, families, children, women, children, were evacuated. It was all falling very rapidly, but I never felt that Baghdad is, through the ethnic cleansing of the civil war that took place in 2007, it's pretty much a Shia city, and the Shia militia, funded and run, in many cases from Iran, are all over the town, all over Baghdad. I mean, it's not, I never thought that Baghdadi really thought he could take Baghdad. I think that he, like his predecessor in Zarqawi of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, just wants to start a civil war between Sunnis and Shias and then see what happens. And maybe it'll be good for him. Who knows what Baghdadi really thinks? Jerry?
To kind of a non-journalist, it appears that the story came very late. ISIS had a lot of momentum before the Western media kind of got the story. Do you think there was a failing there?
I was shocked by that. When Mosul fell, I got a call from the senior executive producer for Frontline, David Fanning, and he said, "What are we going to do about ISIS?" And I sort of was like, like most Americans, and I was sort of, do you mean the United States, or do you mean Frontline? So he said, well, both, frankly, but right now, why don't we just send you? And we went in, and before going, I took a bunch of reports, and I went up to a country house, and I sat there, and I read through these reports, and in them were the tale that we tell of the demonstrations, the long, slow boil, as one colleague put it. that resulted finally in the fall of Mosul, when finally it was in our newspapers and we woke up to it. But it was remarkable that all this had gone on. I had been to Iraq many times, followed it, but I sort of was doing other projects, so I wasn't paying attention. It just shows how much can fit on the front page of the New York Times. There's a big world. And when I was talking with Dexter Filkins of the New Yorker, who's won many journalism awards for his excellent reporting, he felt the same way, that when he went in just before we did, he knew nothing about those demonstrations. Maliki had done his best to keep the cameras away from there. We had actually found a Sunni cameraman who lived out there, who had taken a lot of photos. We were lucky to put them on television really for the first time. But it wasn't, it was a surprise. And it really was instructive, about how little we know about what's going on in the world when we're not paying attention.
From who did you get that crude footage of the executions?
Some of it is ISIS propaganda footage, and then we did our best to establish its truth. We were limited we couldn't waltz around inside their territory and film those things ourselves.
That's clear, but just you took it from the internet, from online?
Oh yeah, we took a lot of stuff off the internet. Absolutely. It actually looks better. I don't know, the colors were a little washed out here. A lot of it is quite, what I'm saying is that they have very good cameras and do a very good job, but unlike any other, they're not like Al-Qaeda of years ago with their crude videos. They really put together some very sophisticated propaganda. So it's remarkable stuff. Yes, right here.
I saw many fighters, but I haven't seen any children, women behind it. Where are they?
They're there. We could have shown you that, but we didn't. This
some-
moves very fast and is very, it's very full. And but there are many children and there are many women.
And are they supportive or are they intimidated?
Are they supportive?
Are they supportive or are they intimidated?
Both. I think that, this woman from Paris who set out days before the Charlie Hebdo attack, I don't know if she joined Nusra or ISIS when she got across the Turkish-Syrian border, but, nobody's forcing her to do that. There are a number of stories of women who have gone in thinking, this was, as I mentioned before, the Spanish Civil War, this was the just cause, and they've come out quite disillusioned. It's a mix. It's a mix of, you hear many different kinds of stories. There's no polling that allows us to really know, how the anecdotes really, represent the whole. Alan?
You started to get at just to this answer, but I'm wondering what you take away from this experience and tell us how you view what's going on in Nigeria, Yemen, Paris, and at the moment, Argentina.
Well, Argentina's an old story that's just being, the rocks are
But
being turned
it's
over.
got
again.
Iran in it, it's got the whole...
Yeah. Well, there's a worldwide struggle between Sunni and Shia. That's clear. Again, I think the rally cry here is that many of these people feel like we haven't done anything for them. We turned our backs on the Sunni tribesmen and left the country, and we left them unprotected. We supported Maliki. Those pictures of Maliki sitting there in the White House with the president and everything is kind of okay are galling to Sunnis who are seeing their communities, ignored or worse. So, that fuels so much resentment, and on we go. Any more?
Thanks so much.